yes, oh, yeah. Uh-huh.
Ascent, genuinely thrilled and excited to bring you two important guests who will be discussing with us what some consider to be the most singularly important theme that every American and every concerned citizen outside of America is thinking and talking about, the occupation movement. Before I do that, although these two guests hardly need an extended introduction, particularly with respect to the first, Victor Wallis, and less true about the second, because the second guest is new to Afghan Ascent, but after the show, he will not be new anymore. He will be asked, and I hope he would agree to be a regular contributor to Afghan Ascent. Victor Wallis, of course, is a well-known, highly respected educator at Berklee College of Music. He's also a frequent and regular contributor to Afghan Ascent. In fact, he's an official consultant for this television program. The second guest, Joe Ramsey, is a young scholar, educator, writer, film critic, was published extensively on numerous cultural themes, in addition to producing substantial books, and also promises to be a prolific contributor to the journal that Victor Wallis edits, Socialism and Democracy. So before I go any further, what I thought I should do, which I've never done before, is to read from an excerpt by way of presenting to the average reader the facets and facts of American economic and political life to which the occupation movement is a response. Some scholars, for example, have noted the following. The top 1% of income earners have more than doubled their income over the last 30 years, according to a Congressional Budget Office, henceforth to be referred as CBO. The report was released just as concerns of the Occupy Wall Street movement were beginning to enter the national political debate. According to CBO, between 1979 and 2007, the income of the top 1% of Americans grew by an average of 275%. 275%. During the same time period, the 60% of Americans in the middle of the income scale saw their income rise by 40%. 40%. Since 1979, the average pre-tax income for the bottom 90% of households has decreased by $900, while that of the top households has decreased. Let me reread that again. Since 1979, the average pre-tax income for the bottom 90% of households has decreased by $900, while that of the top 1% increased by over $700,000. $700,000. As federal taxation became less progressive. From 1992 to 2007, the top 400 income earners in the U.S. saw their income increase 392%. 392%, and their average tax rate reduced by 37%. In 2009, the average income of the top 1% was $960,000. $960,000, with a minimum income of $343,927. In 2007, the richest 1% of the American population owned 34.6% of the country's total wealth, and the next 19% owned 50.05%. Thus, the top 20% of Americans owned 85% of the country's wealth, and the bottom 80% of the population owned 15% only. Financial inequality was greater than inequality in total wealth, with the top 1% of the population, 1% of the population owning 42.7%. The next 19% of Americans owning 50.3%, and the bottom 80% owning 7%. However, after the Great Recession, which started in 2007, the share of total wealth owned by the top 1% of the population grew from 34.6% to 37.1%, and that owned by the 20% of Americans grew from 85% to 87.7%. The Great Recession also caused the drop of 36.1% in median household wealth, but a drop of only 11.1% for the top 1%, further widening the gap between the 1% and the 99%. During the economic expansion between 2002 and 2007, the income of the top 1% grew 10 times faster than the income of the bottom 90%. In this period, 66% of total income gains went to the top 1%, who in 2007 had a larger share of total income than at any time since 1928. This is in stark contrast with surveys of US populations that indicate an ideal distribution that is much more equal and a widespread ignorance of the true income inequality, and wealth inequality. Gentlemen, these are staggering facts, and I believe to a considerable extent, correct me if I'm wrong, the occupation movement is an attempt at addressing these issues. How and how?
Well, I think, first off, thank you for having me on the program. It's a real privilege to be able to address these issues in a public context, in a public forum. And I think that's what Occupy has accomplished already, contrary to those who say it doesn't have concrete demands or isn't accomplishing anything. It has, in fact, taken this fact, this incontrovertible fact of income and wealth inequality and the resultant social and political inequality, and thrust it into the center of the national dialogue, the international dialogue as well, but particularly in this country where we are, most of us, brought up, contrary to our experiences, to be taught and to believe and to say that there isn't social class. That there's only one class in America, it's the middle class, right? That, and I think the Occupy movement and the language of the 99% and the 1% has broken through, so that now class is being discussed in not just in academic journals like Socialism and Democracy, where it's been an issue for a long, long time, and I mean, it has thrusted. I just in the train today, I said the Boston Metro letters about, basically, is capitalism the best system we could do? Do we need a radical redistribution of wealth? I see the Occupy movement as fulfilling a function a little bit like that child in the old story about the emperor with no clothes. The emperor has no clothes, and he parades every year, and all his subjects act as if he has clothes and treat him respectfully, though they all know that he has no clothes. But one day a child naively says, the emperor has no clothes, and suddenly everyone knows that there's a scandal, that the emperor has no clothes. And I think the Occupy movement is it hasn't said something necessarily new, but the way in which and the persistence with which it has said a simple truth, that we have a 1% roughly of this population that is dominating our economy, that is controlling the wealth and therefore the political processes as well. Just the simple assertion of that truth has changed the discourse. The Occupy isn't even saying in a united way what to do about it. It's saying it's wrong, perhaps. and we need to do something about it. Just insisting on that simple truth has forced the conversation. We all can now speak what we already knew, in a way, right? And now we must speak of it. And I think what's exciting is we have a real opportunity now to speak about these things in places and with people that we wouldn't have been able to before. And what we make of that moment, I think, it remains to be determined. But now that we have that opportunity, has something to do with this occupation movement. And I think it's a really exciting time to be alive in this country.
And I would add to that just the urgency of this process from a historical point of view. It's come none too soon. I mean, when the economic depression first hit in 2008, I was wondering, well, what kind of reaction is there? Who's doing anything? And it took a little while, and I thought back, really, it's not that dissimilar from the 1930s. It was a little while before the suffering actually led to effective popular mobilization. But I would say that on top of all the factors that stimulated popular mobilization back in the 30s, there is now the added factor of the environmental crisis, which has, on top of the economic crisis, put the whole question of survival on the table, really. And what's remarkable is to see how, for example, you had the United Nations Conference on the Environment in Durban, which was taking place over the past 2 weeks, which was virtually ignored by the US press, poo-pooed, kind of the importance of it denied. And so you have, in the Occupy movement, an expression of a widespread popular awareness that the officials do not speak for us, which is what was said explicitly in an interruption during that conference by a young woman from Vermont who interrupted the official American delegate and received a standing ovation from the other delegates present, just saying that the US, by obstructing the progress on the environment, was not representing us any more than it was everyone else in the world who's affected by it.
Yeah.
Please.
I think this speaks to one of the really important points of the Occupy movement. If we could just focus on perhaps the unifying symbol besides the Occupy tactic of seizing public land and insisting on one's right to hold it for political demonstration. But the other key concept, right, is this notion of the 99%. We are the 99%. I mean, there's a couple key points, I think, that are implied in that statement. One is that there is a 1%, right? It, in a way, is pointing the finger at the 1%. It's not, which is to say, those who control and rule and who, in fact, are rich because we are poor or struggling. I mean, I think that is a major move forward. It's not simply saying there is poverty and that's bad, or that's wrong, or that's sad, or we need to do something about it. It isn't saying, please, rich people, give us more. It isn't pleading. It is pointing the finger and holding at least a class of people, if not necessarily specific individuals, accountable for the state of things. And it is suggesting, I think, a causal relationship, right? Not simply there are rich and poor, and it has to do with how hard people work, but that some people are rich because others are poor. And so I see it's about delegitimizing, that is to say, calling out raising the question of why should we allow these people who get rich off of us and who don't consider it, in fact, don't want us to take seriously even the planetary crisis we're facing, the environmental crises. Why should they be allowed to rule? The 99%, it points the finger. It's about, rendering illegitimate the 1% that rules, but it's also a statement about power because it's 99-1. When it's not just about injustice and irresponsibility of the 1%, but the potential power that if the 99% can come together, and we haven't yet, but we're maybe making progress through this movement, if we can take it back. We don't have to put up with the 1% forever. And their type of a rule. And I think it is urgent, because if we don't, this planet may turn into a flaming Venus, if you believe some of the leading climatologists. We can't afford the rule of the 1% as a human race, regardless of our class location, but certainly not if we're in the 99%.
Incredible. I think we're going to take a very, very short break, and then we'll be right back to continue this most substantive discussion that we're having. Well, if you recall these staggering facts which are serving as perennial themes for the Occupy movement were being analyzed so thoroughly that I almost did not want to break the conversation, but I did, and now we're back to it. So getting back to our theme then, how are we going to diffuse these poignant facts to the American public?
Well, programs like this certainly have a role to play, don't they? I think we need many strategies and many tactics. Certainly we have one of our major problems is that the very discourse and discussions, the very media upon which we theoretically depend for our information and our dialogue, our range of opinions, the media on which Americans depend to formulate their views on the world, are owned and controlled by the 1%, or even less than the 1%, perhaps the 0.1%. And this is a huge barrier, or has been a barrier to, I think, the development of political movements and political consciousness in this country. But I think that's changing too. I mean, I think we have with the internet, with community media networks, perhaps like this one, publications like Socialism and Democracy and so forth. We have enough of an independent media now that people know, even if it hasn't reached a critical mass of Americans, we have enough of an alternative to be able to see the mainstream media, for what it is, the corporate media, and so I think we need a whole range of tactics, but frankly, even the mainstream media is paying attention to Occupy right now, and it may be perhaps because we have the persistence of the movement in seizing public spaces and not going away. I think is a valuable tactic in this age where, if and when mainstream media organizations, corporate media organizations, cover controversial issues like this, they do it very quickly and they move on. Right? The Occupy tactic has made it difficult, if not impossible. They'll still find ways to marginalize us and to talk about us as dirty hippies instead of serious political, intellectual activists. But it's made it more difficult to ignore. And I think the Occupy tactic has played a role in breaking through that media resistance. But nonetheless, but it's not the end. We're going to need to find new tactics, and we are seeking new tactics for getting the word out because I think we're in a prolonged, creative, nonviolent guerrilla war against this 1% machine, and we're going to need to adapt as they adapt to us, So I don't have the answer yet, but I mean, I think shows like this are part of that answer, actually.
Yeah, I think also another one is Democracy Now!, which now is picked up by over 1,000 stations around the country, the daily 1-hour program, which is very good. And I think just building on what Joe says, there's a kind of dialectic between, on the one hand, these internet technologies and the direct physical presence of people in the streets, that the internet allows for very rapid diffusion of bits of information, but it's the physical presence of people in the street that really forces our attention, forces others to pay attention to us, and also brings us into direct contact with each other, so that there's a real learning process that takes place in that way.
Yeah, and part of what we're learning, and I think that has been learned by those who have spent time at various occupations, whether Dewey Square in Boston or at Zuccotti Park in New York City, is not simply the facts that many of us have been reading on the internet, right, or hearing from Democracy Now!, but it is, again, that emperor has no clothes moment. We know that others know too, and that they know that we know. And this changes the nature of the knowledge. We're not just alone with it. And there's a potential power in the community, right? Wherever 2 or 3 are gathered, or 200 in the knowledge of this truth, I think there's the potential for courage, for people. If not, we don't have the critical mass yet, but the seed or the suggestion. We have a symbol of what the future might look like. If in 3 months we have accomplished as much as we have with Occupy, what if we had 3 years of a similar type of momentum? What would the world look like if we've been able to change the discussion in 2 to 3 months? What change is possible in a year if we can keep it up, right?
Yeah, and I think it's not only the presence and what our presence shows to others, but it's also the process of developing ways of dealing things, beginning the process of creating alternative institutions. So the process of discussion, as in the General Assemblies, and then the spokes councils, which have developed out of the General Assemblies to facilitate exchanges among people who have common experiences and then bring them together to a larger unit and so on. So one of the challenges really to bring about radical social change is that you have to be prepared to really run the society when you have the power.
Right.
But you have to develop that ability in part before you have the power. And so it's not an all or nothing thing. They have all the power and we have none of it. We're building power in the course of developing our own institutions at the same time.
Yeah.
In fact, I would like us to really elaborate patiently and carefully on the internal structure of the Occupy movement by talking about terms such as the General Assembly that you referred to.
Sure.
Then there are these promising references to direct democracy. These are, of course, exciting lexicons, but I wonder if people really know what is meant by General Assembly, by the spokes assembly out of which it grew, and direct democracy. Let us flesh this out for my viewers.
Sure. Well, to start with the General Assemblies, I mean, the General Assemblies are essentially the decision-making bodies of the Occupy movements. And I say movements because at this point there is no General Assembly or any other structure formally that unites the various occupations or the Occupy movements, most of which now don't actually occupy physical space since they've been driven out by the police in their respective cities. Another topic to pick up. But the General Assemblies are this decision-making bodies, if you will, the only or the highest authority of the occupies, of the occupations. And these are essentially, these are bodies that operate by consensus. That is to say, in Boston, for instance, at Dewey Square, now we're not meeting at Dewey since we've been driven out, but even as I speak, there is a General Assembly happening at St. Paul's Church at just off the Boston Common. We've moved them inside for the winter because the cold has become quite extreme, unbearable. General Assemblies are mass meetings facilitated by a rotating group of individuals that meet independently of the group in an open meeting, in which they decide and fine-tune the structure for the next meeting. The facilitators move us through a process that has been consented to by the group at the level of process. This process includes announcements from various working groups. For instance, we have a media working group, an outreach working group. We have an education working group called the Free School University, which actually a sub-part of that was the Howard Zinn Memorial Lecture Series, which I had the pleasure to bring Victor in to give the inaugural address, which is on the web. If you go to Zinn Lectures, you Google Howard Zinn Memorial Lecture Series, you can watch them. We've taped everything. But there are working groups.
Howard Zinn Memorial Lectures is what you're supposed to tune in.
Yes.
Tell them more.
And the great radical BU professor who passed away not too long ago and who would be there with us and in fact is there with us in spirit. But we have working groups who make announcements of what's going on, right? Working groups make announcements and then later people make proposals. Working groups make proposals for things that should be taken up by Occupy Boston as a whole. So for instance, just the other night I was involved in a group, the Socialist Caucus at Occupy Boston, that made a proposal for a demonstration. Or rather made an announcement inviting people to it. It was then discussed by the assembly, and that was not a proposal, that was an announcement, so it didn't need to be voted on. But basically anything that's agreed upon by the organization is something that goes through a consensus process, where anyone attending the General Assembly has the right to object, has the right to question, to support, to amend, and in fact to block if they feel so strongly about the issue that they want to, that they would actually leave the movement. People don't block lightly, but if there's something that's about to be passed by the majority, or even by consensus, which we define as over 75% of those present, you have a strong objection, you can block it. And if you have a principled reason for blocking it, that actually the group will take that under advisement. So it's essentially direct democracy in which everyone has a view. Money has no say. right? And it's many people have found it, although it can be a laborious and a time-consuming process, it's very self-affirming, and I think it has been very good, at least so far, as in terms of bringing new people into these discussions to hear arguments about what should be done, both about logistics, how are we going to feed ourselves, how are we going to stay warm in the winter, as well as around political questions of what type of language should we use to communicate with people. What sort of unity statement should we put out? Should we make demands on the existing state structure, or simply state our principles and our grievances, knowing that the demands will follow once we build, institutions that are up to the task of challenging the state, right? So it's been a real learning process, but the key point is that it's a facilitated direct democracy process, which is open to anyone listening to this. It's open to anyone in the city of Boston, anyone who's in Boston and in solidarity with the cause can come down and they can make proposals. They can also just get on what we call STACK, which is just open discussion at the end of every meeting. Sometimes it takes a while to get there, but I've often thought that STACK should come earlier in the meeting. We have discussion about the process as well. But STACK is essentially, you get on STACK, someone writes your name down in the order of where people show up, and people can say whatever they want to the movement.
It's remarkable.
You can criticize things that have happened. You can call for new types of action. You can just talk about why you're there, what you'd like to see changed. You get your 2 or 3 minutes, depending on how many people, what time it is, how cold it is. The facilitators make various adjustments to the process.
Under ideal conditions, correct me if I'm wrong, the new practices, new ways of decision making that are being practiced at these confines of the General Assembly is probably what Victor meant when he said alternative institutions could be developed from these practices as a replacement of the, should I say, inadequate institutions that we have now under the banner of representative democracy.
Right.
Why not? Why couldn't we? Yeah.
Go ahead.
I mean, in this country, we're raised to believe that democracy is, well, first of all, that we have a democracy, and secondly, that's a good thing, that people having a say in their, in decisions that affect their lives is a virtue. I don't think we have that in the political realm, but we certainly don't have it in the economic realm. Why oughtn't we to have general assemblies of various sizes and, that are located in neighborhoods, that are located in workplaces, that are located in schools? Why shouldn't the decisions of our institutions, the institutions that affect our lives, economic as well as political? In fact, why shouldn't we politicize the economic? And to say, why shouldn't we have general assemblies in our daily lives? Why shouldn't, I'm not saying Occupy Boston itself should grow, but why not take this form and forms like it and democratize our daily lives?
So,
why not? And I think that's possible. That's really,
and there's big interest in democratizing workplaces, and there have been experiences of that, of course, in other countries, and to some extent in this country. But I think that's something that will have to increase, because it's one of the things that can give people a more concrete idea of what an alternative economy looks like.
Correct.
That it's actually that the workers themselves are making decisions of about what they produce, and not just about their working days, but about what they produce, how much they produce, for whom, what their relationship is to the community, what their practice will be if there's a decline in demand for certain things, how they should even get together with workers of other enterprises to coordinate complementary activities, and to change the types of things that they're producing, so that instead of producing useless or harmful substances, they're producing healthy and useful things.
Yeah. I mean, another thing that we're taught in this country is that really that the average people, maybe it's not always told to us as if it's us, but about the people in general, are lazy, incapable, which is all a way of saying we need these bosses, we need the 1% over us, right? It's the Steve Jobs of the world who are the creative talents, and thank goodness for them, otherwise we wouldn't have our iPhones. There's little mention made of the actual engineers who created the technology, let alone the manufacturing workers in China who are producing those iPhones. And similarly here, I think we're raised on this ideology that gets people to doubt, that if not themselves, maybe themselves as well, but others, and certainly our ability to make big decisions and to as if we need the threat of starvation in order to work, as if without the incentive of greed,
no one would ever be creative. I mean, these are just lies. But we don't get to see, you can really see how big they are as lies when you come to something like a General Assembly. And not just the General Assemblies, but the working groups that meet outside of the General Assemblies, where people, not being paid, people who are working 46 hours a week, also unemployed people, and everything in between, who come together and are spending hours in discussion, hours editing articles for the new the Boston Occupier newspaper, who are spending hours, going around to talk to all local businesses to get donated food to sustain the occupation. It's again breaking down that cynicism and that sense of hopelessness or incapacity, not both in ourselves and in others, and in learning that other people care too and are capable too. Then we then are willing to step forward ourselves and we change ourselves. And there's that dialectic back and forth between the other and the self. And before you know it, this idea of, that we need individualism and greed and the fear of starvation or homelessness to keep us working, making a society, is revealed as a lie. And once it's revealed as a lie, the only thing standing really between us and a new world is, perhaps, I guess, the police. Which we can, you know what I mean? But even then, it meant even perhaps many of the police can be won to our way of thinking as they see these occupies, develop. So I mean, the 1% again stands more and more nakedly exposed in its basically in its not only in its greed and in its destructive effects environmentally, in its exploitative relationship to the masses of people, but in its non-necessity. In fact, 1%ers, we know it's probably not even that fun for you because you have to be worried about controlling the society and worried about your next profit margin. This 99% movement will make the 99% the 100%, and we can all be free together to work for a better world. It's not like it's necessarily fun at the top, right? So, I mean, I think we're proving there's struggles, there are challenges in these General Assemblies. It's not all, roses and candy. There are, but that's precisely, I think, where the learning happens is through the struggle, and we're struggling together, and that makes a big difference.
I think it's interesting also to talk about the relationship between those who have a lot of political experience and those who are drawn into this process just by their condition, including people who themselves have no place to live and who come into these settlements. Yeah. And in a sense, this is what it's all about. It's partly to embody their condition, and they may not be oriented towards the theorizing or the political work or all of that. And I don't know if, in terms of your direct experience, you know more than I do about this, but the dynamic, the relationship between those who have been more politically formed on the one hand, and those who come into it out of desperation and necessity, and just finding a place where they're treated with respect and offered food and health care and even a place to stay.
Anyone at Dewey Square who showed up, whether it was their first day or their 72nd, that's how long the occupation lasted, could eat, could sleep there, could have water, could have their basic human needs met. The only, perhaps the one that we're having difficulty with was staying warm because the police weren't allowing us to move in winterized tents. But I mean, that's another way in which you might argue that the occupations prefigure a different, they stand as a symbol and perhaps point towards the potential for a new society. A society where, regardless of whether you have money or not, you have the right to eat.
Correct.
You have the right to a place to stay, where these things are not treated as profit opportunities. We had medics for those who were sick. They weren't. We had sometimes doctors, sometimes nurses, sometimes people who had other sorts of medical training. We didn't have the resources of the 1% dominated society, but we nonetheless were trying to take care of people's basic needs, and that in a way again is another powerful statement. In addition to the political democracy, there was the sense of an economy without money. And we did fundraising too, because there's other ways in which in this society you can't, run newspaper ads and get your word out without some money and so forth or whatever. Or it could be more challenging anyway. It wasn't about just being pure and outside of the system, but nonetheless we're trying, people took a lot of, I talked to people at Dewey, what they were most passionate about was precisely this aspect. That we had a kind of communal economy. Some people would call it communist, some people would call it egalitarian or good-based, rather than money-based. But I think this is a powerful thing. The fact we were doing that did introduce some really some challenges for the movement, which we could talk about, because there were people who were coming for the food.
Correct.
So they could set up in a tent and not get harassed by the police, right? In the sense that that homeless people can't just usually set up a tent on a street corner. They might be able to sleep in a crevice, outside a foreclosed home, right? That they're not allowed inside. But at Dewey, at least they could gather and perhaps be warmer. So people came for that reason. And I think in some cases, definitely some people were politicized and radicalized by that. I think and also I think some people who maybe were getting into the movement for idealistic reasons, but who had never seen a poor person, perhaps a hungry person up close, got to also have some of their preconceptions broke down. I mean, I didn't live in the camp personally, so I don't have the authority to speak to that as much as some. I came down there after work. I came down there, on my weekends and whenever I could, as often as I could. But definitely we saw that dialectic. But there were real challenges in that too, because this society, built on greed, it creates mental disorders for people, and and all kinds of social pathologies. People who are raised, getting kicked and beaten about, but like dogs, and threatened, living with the threat of starvation and being told it's all their fault, and being isolated, feeling isolated, and relying on substances to try to warm the belly when you don't have love. You know what I mean? This showed up at our occupation too.
Of course.
These are challenges, but in a way, it's a reminder of how much, of how we need not only to be changing the economic distribution of wealth, but building a kind of revolution within the revolution, where we are learning from each other and improving each other as we work together. We shouldn't fool ourselves about how much work we have to do.
Sadly, some reporters were speaking about what they called the negative elements.
Oh yeah, right.
That became the necessary and sufficient conditions for police intervention on the behalf of the public, to protect the public from these negative elements. How did you feel about that?
I mean, I have a number of responses. One is, Occupy had set up committees on winterization, had expressed to the police very clearly in writing and verbally that we were working on and wanted to work on any and all health issues that we were aware of or that the police were claiming to be aware of in the city, particularly around clean water and clean food supplies, and around keeping warm, right? And also having more just safe tents in general. The police blocked the entry of those tents, and this is actually quite humorous, they blocked the entry. They arrested our sink. We brought in a sink to clean the dishes, and they appropriated the sink. So in addition to that, if the police were concerned about crowding, why were we crowded if we were? Because the mayor didn't allow us to expand the occupation back on Columbus Day, or what we called Indigenous Peoples Day, in honor of those who were slaughtered by Columbus and enslaved. When we expanded that occupation down to the next block, they used force, arrested 146 people, including many people I know, using quite a bit of violence to keep us from spacing out, right? So on the one hand, if there were any issues that could be improved health-wise, the police were actually stopping that from occurring. We were working on it and wanting to, both with the funds we had appropriated and through our own volunteer efforts. The second issue, so basically, I think it's an excuse. It was an excuse. They wanted to shut the protest down, and they used the claim about public health and safety as an excuse. In fact, if they created or made it more difficult for us to be safe and healthy, and then used that as an excuse to repress the occupation, which is kind of like one percenters closing down the factories in an urban area, and creating conditions of poverty, and then invoking the fact there's poverty for putting more police on the streets, or for taking various kinds of punitive actions against a community, right? When people rely on whatever income, other forms of the informal economy for income or whatever, right? With using that as, you sit out, the state and the capitalists create a situation of difficulty, and then they use the difficulty as an excuse to kind of crack down. But I mean, the real fundamental point I would make here is that really, what's the real threat to public health and safety today? It's represented, at least symbolically and in fact in practice, by those financial towers, Bank of America, et cetera, these financial capitalists who have a predatory relationship to the planet, to the people, who are essentially sucking our blood and our labor and polluting our planet to the point of destruction. This is the real public health and safety threat we face. And places like Dewey Square and Zuccotti Park and these occupations are precisely allowing us to talk about that. They were creating a space for discussion, organization, and action about the real public safety threat today, the 1% and their capitalist system. And that, if you will, if there was a threat to the public posed by these occupations, it's precisely the threat to the 1% that likes to define its interest as the public interest, in the sense that we were cultivating the possibility for talking critically and acting critically to change their system.
Yeah, always with the media, there's this kind of double standard. They'll look at something and express outrage at an immediate demonstration without even mentioning the conditions that bring it about. And there was also, along the same lines, a rather good editorial in the second issue of the Boston Occupier, which took up the charge. Well, they're costing the police a lot of money to it, and they came up. They told us, well, $13 million that the police had to have
for the country. I think that's for the whole country, nationally.
Well, whatever it was, but it was maybe some tens of millions, say aloud, compared to the cost imposed on the whole society by the banks and the failure and the bailout and so on, which they estimated at $4 trillion. So, I mean, there's no comparison. But the thing is, somehow the media, with this kind of myopia that's systematically cultivated by the media, to have you look only at the complaint and so even to criminalize dissent, while accepting sort of just as a natural course of events, the air we breathe is the control of the society by these people who are plunging millions into homelessness and desperation. That doesn't rate their outrage. So it's really quite shocking, this double standard.
And now I think we might also want to talk about the demography of the situation. As you know, and according to what I read, about 52% of the American population are positively inclined towards supporting the movement. However, when you break down the numbers, again, according to the research that I did, and feel free to dispute it, only individuals between the ages of 50 and 64 seem to be the preponderant supporters out of this 52% of the American population that are in support of the movement, which tells me that the young, the very, very young, whom you think would be remarkably attracted to this new thinking about the future society as a moral economy, are not. How are we going to motivate these very, very young people to be interested in this new thinking?
Occupy the high schools. I don't know. I mean, there's many answers to that, ways to try to approach that question. I mean, I hadn't heard those particular statistics before, because young people are quite prominent in the occupations, particularly in Boston. There is one of the most common cries, chants at some of the early demonstrations, which caught on like wildfire, was a chant that said, how much richer can they, the 1%, get? Cancel all student debt. Right? There's definitely a prominent student component, a college student or recent, undergraduate, recent graduates are quite prominent in Boston. There's quite a number of young people. So I'm not sure about those numbers, but it is quite possible. I mean, certainly that there's much cultural force, trying to keep people from thinking about the possibilities of changing the world. I mean, the media apparatus that Victor has alluded to, the economic constraint itself, right? That people fear, that people live with, can then, by this kind of like mean-spirited kind of hazing logic of like, well, I'm suffering, so who are these people in Dewey Square to think that they don't have to suffer too, right? I mean, I don't know what the psychology of young people who would be critical of the movement is, but I think probably it's mainly a product of not actually having been down and not having actually been exposed to the discourse. I mean, I've had friends on Facebook who wrote really kind of very thoughtful friends who wrote some very like disparaging things about the comments, like who are these smelly hippie protesters? And I just asked them, like, have you even gone to the website, occupyboston.org? People say, oh, you don't have a message, you're not clear. Well, we passed a declaration. And yes, it didn't make demands on the state for reasons we could get into, why we haven't made demands the focus. But it does say our goal, I quote, is a society where the needs of all are prioritized over the profits of a few.
Mm-hmm. But
so, I mean, anyone who wants to do investigation can find it, but if people don't, and if the media doesn't, if the media gives them the sense they know, right, but without actually knowing, perhaps that explains some of the dismissal that may be occurring in some circles, and we need to break that down. We need to get to them directly.
Correct.
Right?
That seems to be the challenge that the Occupy movement has to hit head on. How do you communicate this new thinking, the future society, so that it could become part and parcel of everybody's everyday vocabulary?
Yeah.
How do we demonize it less? How do we make it less illusory? How do we make it possible for individuals who would hear to this brilliant talk that you're giving today as something that could be done, something that doesn't necessarily have to contradict what we call human nature?
Right.
Right.
Well, it's a multi-layered process, and I mean, this Occupy movement is part of what's giving it a dynamic, but the discussions take place on so many different levels. Some people still act only sort of through the internet. There are new internet phenomena like the Roots Action, for example, which is a kind of internet activism, but which aspires to really go beyond just the internet. It's using the internet to build up a following. I mean, it's built on sort of similar principles to Move On, but without the kind of ties to the democratic leadership that Move On has. So there's that's one dimension. And it depends where you are, what kind of things you can do. There's a very important new book, which I mentioned in my talk at the Occupy, by John Nichols, called About Socialism, that challenges the negative stereotypes of socialism in America very effectively. It's a book, it's called The S Word, The History of an American Phenomenon of Socialism. But John Nichols, who's an editor in Wisconsin, building on the whole radical tradition of the state of Wisconsin itself, but on a national scale, talking about it and going way back to Thomas Paine. So this could be have an important impact, and I say that thinking also of Howard Zinn and how, since the time People's History of the United States was published in 1980, over 2 million copies have been sold. It changed the whole conception in this country of the nation's founding, the discovery and the transformation in the view of Columbus. Well, this has to happen in relation to socialism and to the place of socialism in American life also. And I think John Nichols' book will be a help in that direction as well. And I think there is a kind of openness now, also in view of the fact that for the last few years, the right wing in this country has been using socialism as a kind of insult for any kind of progressive measure. And I think this has opened people up to thinking that there may be something positive in this if these clowns are denouncing it the way they are.
So the time has come for the editor of Socialism and Democracy to celebrate that.
Well, I mean, I'm very enthusiastic about the Occupy movement in this sense, because it does show that there's a real opening on the part of the public, absolutely. But it's only the first step, because there's the opening, but there's not yet the political movement that can eventually take power. I mean, so it's really a first step. It's establishing of a context, of a framework in which all the discussions can take place and all the learning experiences for people from so many different kinds of backgrounds and with so many different kinds of obstacles to their participation, some of the kind of handicaps that Joe mentioned and so on. So it's a very complex process, but this is a major leap that's been taken with this Occupy movement that's suddenly shown that it's a popular thing everywhere to challenge the class domination in this country.
And then this is a question for Joe. Then, do you think to be advisable to link this movement with a new political party? If so, how?
Well, I think. Well, certainly, I don't think we should link it with the existing political parties. There's discussion about this within Occupy. I haven't I don't have a position on that question. I think it would, you know, would hinge on what type of party. You know, I do think that at a certain point, we need to organize on a national level. I mean, I think having some, I wouldn't oppose in principle anyway the notion of having some sort of, the Occupy Party. I don't know, the Occupy Party, or at least to have some sort of national, organization so that we can in fact, when we want to, in addition to having autonomous action, independent action that's site-specific across the country, we could, in fact, mobilize days of action, whether it's general strikes, symbolic action, marches, or advocacy on particular issues.
We have about 3 minutes left,
Okay.
and I want you to use the 3 minutes to say something extremely important that you would like to say to my audience.
Okay. Should we look into the camera? No.
It would be wonderful if you can look at the camera.
Yeah. My aspiration for the Occupy movement in Boston, as perhaps one next step, is following our eviction from Dewey Square. I believe we should champion the cause of all those who are facing eviction in this city and across the country. I think the Occupy movement should become more and more of a network for defending those who are coming under attack by the system. I think we already are doing this, but I think we need to even more so, working with organizations such as, City Life, Vida Urbana, and others, newly emerging networks. I mean, we need to go where the people are actually being affected by the system. In addition to raising the idea, one of the big chants now is you can't evict an idea. Right? This idea of the 99%, its potential power and the injustice of 1% rule, that idea is out, but we do need to materialize it in practices, and we need to bring it to the people and show people who might be kind of sitting on the sidelines a little bit, like sympathetic to the cause. Maybe they knew all this already, that the world's messed up, but not sure if are they just college kids or ex-hippie radicals or serious about wanting to really change the world. Even though they've been there 72 days in the park, do they really mean it? I think we need to prove to people that we really mean it. I think we've been evicted, we should be champions of those who face eviction. And not just literally from their homes, but those who are having anything they need to survive stripped away from them. I think we need to be a solidarity network, and if we do that effectively, we'll build the mass roots. And we'll not only build the mass roots, but we'll learn more about what really needs to be done and can be done.
Yes, and I would say that along with this activist component goes the educational and the theoretical component, and the two have to be integrally related. They have to go advance together, and people will understand more as we get involved in these struggles.
Well, this has been, as I predicted from the very beginning, an incredibly informative, enlightening program that should stretch your imaginations and that should increase your interest in becoming morally and politically vigilant, and think about these extremely important issues that they have raised tonight. They have given us visions of our possibilities. They have given us projections of ways of life and ethics of living and new aesthetics that we can establish for, with, and on the behalf of the human species. This has been your host, Theodoros Kiros, for African Ascent.